we're starting the third session, third and last session of the conference with a very important topic. We said that the COVID-19 pandemic has really affected the way in which we approach developing capacities, national evaluation capacities. And so now it's time to get to dig deeper into what does fragility mean for evaluation. And I am joined here today by a very distinguished panel of representatives of so different organizations. I have to my left Juliette Parker. She's the director of the Active Learning Network for Accountability and Performance. It might be more familiar to you if I say ALNAP, right? Because ALNAP is really the humanitarian evaluation network that Juliette will tell us a bit more about this important organization. We also have Andrea Cook. She's the director of evaluation of the United Nations World Food Program. And you know the important role that the World Food Program plays in assisting people in need during crisis and emergencies. We have heard in the opening remarks of the director the impact of the COVID-19 and the compounded crisis that we are living on food security, and therefore how important it is the work of our organizations. We also have with us Alison Evans, the Director General of Evaluation of the Independent Evaluation Group of the World Bank Group. And the World Bank, with its vast presence, has been playing a significant role in supporting countries to get out of crisis. We are also joined to get the bilateral perspective by our colleague Isabelle Mercier. Isabelle is the Director of International Assistance Evaluation at Global Affairs Canada. And we have with us Dr. Angelina Matiju-Basugba. She's Assistant Professor of Social Policy and Dean/Director of the National Transformation Leadership Institute at the University of Juba in South Sudan. So without much further ado, considering that we have such a precious panel, I would like to start with a question to all of them, saying, what do you think is the role of evaluation in addressing crisis response? Let me start with you, Juliette.
Great, thank you very much. And also thank you very much for the invitation to be on this panel with such amazing and interesting colleagues on the panel. I'm very much looking forward to hearing what everyone has to say. So as mentioned, ALNAP is the learning network for the humanitarian sector. And as such, of course, I would tend to focus on the learning side of evaluation. The learning within crisis is extremely important particularly because of the pace of change within humanitarian crises. So there are two kind of main focus for learning. One is the learning within the lifespan of a crisis, where the situation can evolve and change quite rapidly. One of the things that we've seen recently coming out of evaluation practices is an increased focus on real-time learning and real-time evaluation, which has come as something of a renaissance in evaluation practices, which really is indicative of the emphasis on real-time learning from within the practicing organizations. And we can see a lot of adaptive management approaches and adjustments within the life of a sometimes quite protracted crisis as being a real important part of evaluation. The second part, of course, is about the importance of learning between crises. At ALNAP, we often look back over 20 or 25 years of evaluations, and you can see that particular crises offer really critical learning points or learning moments for the humanitarian sector, where you can see the sector pivot around particular crises, like the Rwanda genocide, of course, was one very formative one. Also the tsunami evaluation, for example. And we've had a lot of discussions recently with the Ukraine crisis about how the humanitarian sector are seeing the Ukraine response as an opportunity, a potential opportunity to shift and learn and address some of the learnings from previous crises that we have been unsuccessful in addressing. And to see if this crisis, actually partly because of the funding opportunities behind it, can offer an opportunity for a change and a shift within the humanitarian sector. So from a learning perspective, evaluation is critical in addressing learning within crises, but also between, and ensuring that we have a continued evolution of change within the sector. And we can see an evolution of change happening within the humanitarian sector. It's a little slow in places and not as fast as some would want it to be. And also, oh, well, maybe I'll come on to that in a further question. Otherwise, I'll keep going forever.
Thank you very much. Please, Andrea.
Yeah. So for WFP, maybe just to give some figures, in 2021, crisis response accounted for 79% of WFP's funding globally. And the WFP budget, depending on what we're doing, is sort of hovering between 9 and 11 billion US dollars per year. So that's a huge amount of funding going through, primarily to support food security and provide food assistance in emergency settings. But one of the things we're looking at is transitions in and out, and in and out, and in and out of a humanitarian crisis, and looking at how you go further and look at strengthening resilience at different levels, and also try to address root causes of food insecurity. So that factors very much in how we look at evaluation and how we're trying to sort of embed this in our work. So for us, the role of evaluation, looking at crisis response, is very multifaceted. And is embedded, in our view, at different levels to meet different needs in organizations and in partnerships at different times. One of the key issues that we think is very important is not just looking at what WFP is doing, but what WFP is doing through collective action with others. And I'll come to that in a moment. So for WFP, our member states request high levels of evaluation coverage, and we evaluate corporate scale up and also corporate attention evaluation requirements in the organization, depending on the level of mobilization for those different types of responses in the organization. So first off, we do a corporate emergency response evaluations. These are typically evaluations of, say, the COVID response, the Ukraine response, etc. So very high profile, very fast moving emergencies. We're trying to be more sort of attuned and reflective of those, and trying to find an optimum time to carry out those evaluations, to promote learning, to promote transparency, and also to ensure accountability, because that's very important to the WFP board. So that's one type of evaluation that we do. The other is country strategic plan evaluations. As I've said, 79% of funding in the organization is going into emergency response, and that's hardwired into our country programs. So increasingly, we're embedding humanitarian and crisis response issues and questions and related concerns, such as accountability to affected population, looking at humanitarian principles, looking at humanitarian protection. We're embedding that in our country strategic plan evaluations, so that over time we're able to build up a picture of how humanitarian response sits within the wider country program and the wider country partnerships, as I was saying yesterday, particularly as they link in to partnerships with national governments and national implementing partners. And then the third area that I think is really crucially important for humanitarian response is collective evaluations. So the interagency steering committee, which is a kind of UN and multi-stakeholder partnership that is trying to promote collective action in humanitarian response, has an interagency humanitarian evaluation steering group, and we work together to carry out evaluations together. So we're promoting learning, but also accountability and transparency of collective action. So at the moment, we're just about to finish an evaluation looking at the Yemen response over recent years, which I'd really recommend you look out for, because it's a real sort of flagship evaluation. I think it's going to be one of those pivot points that Juliet's talking to. We're doing an evaluation of the collective humanitarian response to COVID as well at the moment, and they're just about to start evaluating the Afghanistan response, responding to last year. So these we see in WFP, and I think globally, no matter where we are, I think these are very important evaluations to try to capture what we're delivering collectively and where we're failing collectively. So maybe I'll leave that there. Okay. Sorry.
Thank you. Please go ahead.
Same question. Great. Thank you. So let me just back up for a moment maybe and just address the question in this way. I think we've got to be thinking about evaluating in crisis and evaluating crisis response. And actually, in a situation that we have now, sort of intersecting crises of a multiple compounding nature. So my first point is to say, I think everything we do right now is somehow impacted by crisis. And we certainly look at our work program in IEG and the World Bank through the lens of how is this now adapting to the circumstances around us, and are we able to touch on the key issues and shift our focus in order to acknowledge that, you know, crisis is now with us and it's coming at us in multiple directions and we need to adapt. And I'll just say a couple more things about that in a minute. But then there is the evaluation of crisis response, which is in the context of the World Bank Group around the COVID response. There was something like an initial $170 billion response over 15 months to the COVID crisis, which has now been wrapped up into a major global crisis response framework, which is trying to tackle the sort of multiple and intersecting crises of now. And it involves a huge amount of front loading of resources, particularly IDA resources. That's the concessional arm of the World Bank. From an evaluation point of view, that is an enormous project to wrap our arms around and to try and understand. And maybe we can get into some of the ways we've tried to unpack that and do that in this discussion. But let me just for a moment go back also to the evaluating in crisis, and just to put a few thoughts out there for things, again, we might pick up on, which is, I think, you know, what evaluating in crisis leads us to do is to be acutely aware of the context. It's easily said, actually more difficult to do, but context just becomes such an important part of thinking through how we go about evaluation and the kinds of evaluation questions we focus on. Timing. If you think about the time path that we kind of normally expect on sort of achievements around project or program interventions, you know, you can imagine a fairly slow, gradual, hopefully upward path that takes time to unfold. I think in situations of crisis, what we see is a much noisier results pathway, and one that it matters very much where you come in as an evaluator. You can be at the, you know, the peak of a kind of a results moment, or you can be in the trough. And it really matters how we understand that results pathway. And that, I think, is a huge challenge when we have, let's be honest, an evaluation toolkit that tends to take a moment in time. And we need to think about that. Then I think there's issues around the challenge of generalization. It's obvious when we're in a crisis situation, I think we're even more challenged to think through, how we move beyond the specific to the general, and whether our evaluation results actually hold beyond the specificity of interventions we may be looking at. And of course, then the responsible evaluation practice issues, do no harm, all of those things they're always important, but they just become even more central, I think, to the way we think about the work we do. So those are some of the things that I think are relevant for the discussion we're going to have today, and I hope we can come back to some of those, but let me pass on to Isabel now.
Good morning, everyone. I think I'll build a little bit on what Alison was saying. When I was looking at this question, I was thinking about my answer, and I thought, for me, I think evaluators, at least in my organization, play a very unique function that can help support my organization pivot and respond to crises. I think we can help build a culture of curiosity, a culture of innovation, and a culture that asks questions about how crises have differential impact on women, on vulnerable populations, and so on. And in times of where there's no crisis, but there never is a time where there isn't a crisis, we could at least be that voice that brings evidence on those topics to bear, so that those things are in the minds of people who will make decisions about responses to crises. So that's on a very macro cultural level. And I think that's a role that we really should play a lot. Another thing I think we should be doing is really trying to understand as evaluators the decision-making cycle of crises. And it's that same thing of the time and the decisions. And really try to understand what kind of evaluative evidence could be brought to bear and make a difference in decisions. It's not the same cycle as a long development program. It's a very different cycle. And I think if we don't understand that cycle, and we don't understand how crises tend to unfold, we will not be able to give products or evaluative evidence that is relevant at the right time. So I think it's up to us to really start understanding how our organizations respond to crises, what's being asked of those people, and what kind of moments are there in their decision-making cycle that we could actually have an impact. I'll give the example of the work that Canada did in the COVID-19 Global Evaluation Coalition. So during a crisis, I think this is a time to get together and be creative and let go a little bit of the constraints that we've placed on ourselves as a community of saying an evaluation takes about a year and so on and so forth, and really think about, in terms of what we have access to and our skill sets, what can we do to bring evidence to bear to decision makers? And I think the Global Coalition did that, in that we really set up an infrastructure for sharing evaluative evidence, so that when our decision makers needed something, some evidence, we were able to give them something. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't a long 1-2 year evaluation, but at least it was better than nothing. And I think that's the sort of mindset that we have to have as evaluators. In times of crisis, I think we have to be a little flexible, actually a lot flexible, and think about what information we can get that will help our decision makers. So I think I've said decision makers a lot of times. I think you could tell I'm really focused on the use of evaluation. And I think that's always something we have to have in our minds.
Thank you very much for an opportunity to be part of this panel. I think I'll start by reflecting about South Sudan as an example, because we're actually living in crisis. If I can say, we are part of handling a numerous number of crises. So really, to us, crisis, apparently, it's like part of life. You just finish one, it comes in another one. Finish this one. I mean, you could find that you are operating under multiple crises, if I can put it that way. So really, when you bring an element of evaluation, you will see that it's very critical. Maybe I can quickly say why South Sudan. I know some of you may be aware of South Sudan. But again, if you may know, we were in civil conflict for 21 years. That led us to the signing of peace agreement in 2005. And we were doing well, and we think we were okay. We were on the right path. Then it took us all the way to 2010 when we had election, 2011 when we decided to divorce. We were part of bigger Sudan. Then we decided to get divorced and had South Sudan and Sudan. And South Sudan was now emerging as a new country, you know, with its own sovereignty. We became member states of the United Nations. We adopted a number of normative standards, the international instruments, and we were able to come to the point where we would say we have our country, we have our policies, we have all those things that requires a particular country to have it. When we were moving in the right track, we thought that we were okay. Another conflict broke out in 2013, and that one was worse because you can imagine you're moving around, you see bodies lying all over on the roads, people, women were raped, children, I mean, a lot of things. I can't go into that right now. But again, when we started picking up and get into, you know, peace agreement and this negotiation with the various, you know, the warring parties, we thought everything was over. Coming into 2014, 2015, people agreed to say, now we can agree to peacefully coexist with one another. Then 2016, another conflict broke out. So you can imagine amidst of that, we do have a period by which we are saying we are getting into development. And when we think we are just about to start development, something else push us into humanitarian. And we all have to direct all our initiative in terms of restoring peace and tranquility, without which we will not be able to do anything. So that pushed us to another area where we had a peace agreement, which was signed in 2018. And right now the country is in the transition period. We were hoping to do elections in 2022, but again, much had not been implemented. When we evaluated what was agreed within the time frame of 4 years, we realized that we had only achieved 27%. And that held us to the point where we had to push the roadmap, to come up with a roadmap that would push the peace agreement to be implemented, or to be able to undertake some of the activities up to 2024, when we are hoping we'll be able to hold elections. Now, what is happening in between here? There's a lot of things around recrafting of new policies, recrafting of new laws, including the legal framework, because you cannot move on without having a permanent constitution. The permanent constitution is the supreme law of the land that guides all the other things. Now, when you come in and operate in so many other activities without having this legal framework that can guide the process, and some of these legal framework, I can argue that they are not so much of permanent in nature, because they can be changed, or they can change at any time. It means that we are operating in not really in a vacuum, but in a situation where it is not consistent. Things are not consistent. They can change at any time. So then here is where we're coming in. Why is evaluation important? For me, I see evaluation is very critical, because it does help us to learn what are the good things, but also what are the bad things. In the process of learning what we have been doing or what we have been practicing, we do draw in a lot of lessons, and the lessons help us to address a number of issues in our planning, in our designing, and also in the implementation. But also it does generate a lot of information that can inform the policymaker, because you're talking about being able to undertake advocacy and lobbying. You do need evidence-based information to inform the policymaker to be able to engage in the process of making the new policies that we are talking about. And you can't get into that unless you have the information that is critical, is authentic, and is able to really being used or verified by a number of people. But again, I see evaluation is very critical, because it helps us in terms of holding our leaders accountable for non-compliance, but also hold them in terms of saying, saying, what is it that they say they will do to the citizen, but also us as citizen, when we do have information, we can hold the key actors in terms of us wanting to really see what are the outcomes and knowing where are we going, where are we coming from? Do we see the change or not? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much to all of you. Really very insightful sharing of information, please. Indeed, thank you very much. And I think it's important to make this distinction about evaluating in crisis, and we are all really experiencing that in so many countries, and from evaluating crisis responses, right? And I really liked also the emphasis that Juliet brought on learning. What are we learning? Therefore, let me dig deeper on what have you learned in your practice, in your organizations, about evaluating in crisis, right? In times of crisis. If you could, we can start with you, Juliet, please.
Sure. I mean, maybe I can talk about two areas. One is, are we learning? Full stop or question mark. And the other is, how are we evolving our evaluation practice to enhance and enable improved learning? In terms of the humanitarian sector, we just produced our State of the Humanitarian System report, which shows that, yes, the humanitarian sector is learning. It is improving, but it's slow and it's incremental and it's very patchy. As part of our 25th anniversary at ALNAP, we've been looking back on what our 25 years of history tell us about where the humanitarian sector has learned and where it hasn't. And we've looked back over the lesson papers, these synthesis papers that we produce quite regularly on different crisis types. And we actually have 20 or 25 years worth of these lessons. And so we did a kind of a review analysis of them, and it showed very starkly that in technical areas, the humanitarian sector demonstrates this beautiful learning curve, from observational to, recommendations to really very firm kind of instrumentalization of recommendations. It's a beautiful learning curve on technical sectoral interventions. And you can see it set out in the language used and the progress of the recommendations. Where we're not progressing is what we call the three intractable learning challenges. Accountability to affected populations, locally led humanitarian action, and linking relief and development. And in those three areas, disappointingly, the recommendations were almost exactly word for word the same now as they were 20 years ago, which every humanitarian knows. Instinctively, you know it and you feel it, but see it so starkly set out was really interesting. And what this really suggested to us is that the humanitarian sector is very good at single loop learning, so getting better and better at what it already does. Where we struggle is around these areas that require a shift in the structure, makeup, and power relations within the sector and collective action. And those are the real challenges. So we're also producing a paper coming out in a few weeks' time, which is looking at presenting a systems mapping of what we know about how and when learning happens in the sector and how and when it doesn't, looking back over 4 case studies. And we have a very beautiful diagram, which what it shows is that learning, adaptation, and change is happening all the time at a project level, all the time. It's bubbling, formal, informal, it doesn't matter. Something like our experiences with COVID demonstrate the rapid adaptability and learning processes of people who are working in country delivering projects is very high. There's then a process, a sort of magic, intangible process by which these learnings start to coalesce and come together in order to influence the mainstream practices of the sector, which is where sometimes it works, like in the use of cash distributions, adoption of mobile technologies, and sometimes it doesn't. And what we are finding is that we have this layer within the humanitarian sector, which we call the institutional permafrost. It's the international organizations who are resistant to change. The incentive structures and the ways that they're developed and the ways that they work and relate to each other actually make them in some ways resistant to learning, particularly learning that requires that bigger shift. What we also found was that learning, of course, will always be you can structure for it, you can formalize it, but there will always be that element of randomness about who you happen to talk to, or your personal work experiences. And in the humanitarian sector in particular, we found some research that we did several years ago, is that the number of operational decisions being made on the basis of evidence in the humanitarian sector is comparatively low. Humanitarians on the whole do not have time to engage with the evidence, which brings us back to the uptake question, which hopefully we'll come on to later. They don't have time to engage with the evidence. They are also instinctive beings, which means that depending on their own personal experiences, depending on the person they last spoke to, and depending on how a situation emotionally resonates with them, will be big influences on the decisions that they're making. And I think when we come to uptake, maybe it's really important to talk about that aspect of how we communicate the learning coming out of evaluations. Very quickly on the what we're learning about evaluation practices. I mentioned earlier about this renaissance that we're seeing on real-time evaluations and real-time learning. And COVID was a really healthy push to the evaluation sector, as well as, all of us in many aspects of our lives. But it was a good push to the evaluation sector to relook at how they conduct evaluation processes or evaluative processes in those early stages of a crisis. Because COVID, of course, meant that, it was a lot of remote access, but also because the humanitarian agencies were dealing with a crisis that they did not know how to handle, which meant that they started bringing in a lot more real-time learning processes, which can be a whole spectrum of approaches, often less formalized and more iterative than formal structured evaluative processes, which enabled a faster and more flexible learning loop within the lifespan of their projects as they were evolving in response to the crisis.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Andrea.
Yeah, thanks. Maybe I'll pick up from Juliet on what we learned from WFP through the COVID response. I mentioned yesterday we took a very different approach to evaluating the COVID response of the organization. When we started to talk to people right at the onset of COVID, people said we can't be learning this 2 years down the line. We have to find a different way of doing it. So we took a sort of developmental approach to that evaluation. We worked on sort of identifying learning priorities and set up a sort of a modular approach to that evaluation. So in COVID, obviously, it was looking at the whole organizational response. It was looking at some sort of high level questions, but also very operational decisions as they were responding. And what we did was we took a modular approach and we identified which were the priorities for early learning versus elements for sort of learning that we knew we needed a little bit sort of further down the line. And what I'm talking about is going from, doing this within a sort of a 6-month period. So those modulars sort of modules click through very, very fast. But then all of that was kind of wrapped up into a wider report that tried to capture through results management systems what was happening in terms of funding, in terms of program, in terms of delivery on the ground, that then kind of got wrapped up within an evaluation report. So we moved very differently in doing that, and it was very appreciated and very much supported that learning. It was very interesting. One of the things we did, which was has never really been done in that kind of evaluation before, we didn't actually produce recommendations. We produced issues for consideration. That did lead eventually to a formal management response for accountability purposes of the organization to the board and to partners. But what was interesting is by the time they got to thinking about that, much of the action, much of the response had already been done. And what then sort of came out were these bigger systemic institutional issues that are, big organizations are like tankers. They're like ocean liners. It takes time for them to turn around. So going back to what Juliet said. So what came out were some of these big systemic issues that then sort of set a template for senior management direction. We learned a lot. I'll focus on the evaluation. We learned a lot from that. So we're now very much adapting this more modular approach in other work. So we're doing an evaluation of the organization's response in Myanmar at the moment. And we've taken that approach there. One of the big evaluations that we're really launching right now is an evaluation to look at the WFP Sahel response. And maybe coming back to what Alison was saying, we need to be trying to find a way for evaluation to work at these different levels in organizations and different sort of partnership dimensions. But we also need to look at needs for evaluation evidence over time. So Sahel, we have evaluated almost all of the Sahel countries, country strategic plans over recent years. And they have all looked at what results is WFP delivering in response and of response. So we've got that. But we hadn't looked at regionally, how is the organization responding? All of those evaluations have shown, and we've got a number of colleagues from Sahel countries here in West Africa, all of them shown that we just keep doing the same thing time after time after time. We're giving lean season support that grows or shifts around geographies depending on what's happening. And that is compacted by conflict and the actions of non-state armed groups in that region. So can we do something from the evaluation that allows us to use the evaluation to break out of that thinking and try to identify different ways of conceptualizing what WFP's offer is to that region, that's looking really in a more out of the box, blue skies thinking about what is the response to bringing humanitarian peace building and development actions together, because the way we're doing things isn't really working. So I think we also can learn a lot from recent years that allows us to sort of just take a very different perspective on what we're evaluating and how, but also how the bodies of evaluation evidence stack together. One other thing I'm really, really passionate about as well is we're evaluators often, many of us in this room. So everything looks like an evaluation. It really shouldn't. What we should be concerned about is learning. I'm really concerned about this term real-time evaluation, because I don't think it's possible. I think we should be talking about real-time learning and really valuing it. So I'll just leave on that one.
I'm glad you said that. I was going to start in a similar vein. So thank you, Andrea, for saying that. I mean, and I think, yeah, it's a caution. I personally am also somewhat concerned about this notion of real-time evaluation. It is the process of learning around engagement and evidence building and supporting that culture that I think Isabel was talking about, that I think we're really focusing on here. And I, just to add to that point, would also say, as evaluators, we also need a big dose of humility. We need, we have to ask ourselves sometime the question, just because we can, should we? Are we the right response? It isn't always the case. And I say this particularly for those of us who sit in, evaluation functions within large bureaucracies. It's really important to understand how we fit into the ecosystem of knowledge and learning within the organization. And it isn't always the case that we should lead. However, having said that, we can do a huge amount and we should do a lot to respond more effectively to the need for learning in the context of crisis. But we have to be very smart, in my view, and strategic about it. And I hear a lot from my counterparts in the World Bank Group. On the one hand, real respect and value for what we are able to do, but sometimes real worry that we're going to be putting demands on them that are coming at the wrong time when they feel genuinely that this isn't the moment they need to take stock. Now, we can argue over that and say, no, we have a view and we think it is the right moment, but it isn't, we don't want to be met with anxiety and fear about what we as evaluators are bringing to the table, which relates to a point about the importance of, I think, psychological safety. We need to be part of creating a degree of safety, which doesn't mean we have to agree on everything. It doesn't mean we don't bring tough messages, but it does mean we create an environment in which we put the ability to engage with evidence and learn from it at the top of the priority list. So just a couple of other things to say. So in terms of kind of what are we learning, I suppose it's the two dimensions. What are we learning as an evaluation group inside the World Bank group, and what are we hopefully supporting in terms of learning within the World Bank group itself around its crisis response and so on. I think we've learned a number of things in relation to the role of evaluation and what we can do. I mean, one of the first things we did around COVID-19 wasn't actually to do evaluation, but was to do synthesis, trawling from our stock of existing knowledge, not because we believe the past is a perfect guide to the future, but because there are insights embedded in the work we've done, the very careful, patient evaluations that we've done in the past of the avian flu response, the Ebola response, the SARS response, that we were, and other aspects of public health response, that we were able to tease out and bring forward and structure it in such a way that it seemed, was available and useful at the point where the World Bank Group was on the hoof trying to design the first stages of its response. So the first thing we did was that. And that actually is something that is referred back to constantly. Was it the best piece of work we've ever done? Maybe not, but it was well-grounded. It was evidence-based because we drew on these evaluations, and it was timely. And therefore, it's had a very long shelf life, that piece of work, sometimes longer than some of our more extensive evaluations. But the second thing is that we did indeed agree with our board that we would do what we called an early stage assessment, which was designed to not pronounce on the effectiveness or otherwise of the response, but to be an assessment guided by a theory of action, not a theory of change, but a theory of action about the components of the World Bank Group's response and how they were unfolding. And Stephen Porter, who's at the back there, was one of the co-task team leaders of one of two early stage assessments we've done. And that was intended to give our board an early insight into how the response was unfolding and where the pinch points were and the pain points may be, and also to have a learning discussion with our counterparts in the institution about, okay, is this where you expect to be? Are there things that we are uncovering here that you want to be thinking about as you continue to roll out this response? And, really and what we did actually was to sort of try and break out some modules from this early stage evaluation to offer those as a platform for real-time discussion. This was a big change for us and for the way in which we interacted with the institution. And it's been an interesting ride. Not everyone has appreciated us being involved in an early stage assessment, even though the stance of the organization is absolutely unequivocally, we've got to learn and we've got to build in as much evidence to drive our response in the best direction. There's still a sense of, hold on a minute, your evaluation, you sit in the ex post box. Why, this is uncomfortable for us. So we've had a lot of management of that response to do, and we're still involved in that. We're still involved in the discussion. So I'm giving you a clear insight that it isn't always, particularly I think in large bureaucracies, welcomed with open arms, and we need to work and be smart as evaluators. And then just finally, I just want to reflect a little bit on on the risks. Relating to Andrea's point about, it's about real-time learning, but not necessarily real-time evaluation. I do think we do need to consider, what is the position of evaluation in this bigger need for quick and timely evidence. What do we bring that others are not able to bring? Where do we partner? How do we manage the downside risks? And let's acknowledge that these are there, that we produce stuff that ultimately isn't useful because speed has overtaken the need for something that is rigorous, robust, and therefore unbiased. So we need to also acknowledge there are some risks in this path, and as evaluation managers and those of us who sort of lead evaluation units, we need to be really attuned to those and to be thinking very strategically and tactically, I think. Just one final point, and I'll pass to Isabel, about learning in the World Bank Group, and I think we have had some really significant successes in that regard. But as a member of the institutional permafrost, as Juliet says, this is slow. It's undoubtedly a slow process. And there is, in times of crisis, which, fair point, they're always with us, but I think we're in a particularly a challenging period right now. There is a bit of a tension, I see, between the amount of effort that goes into the organization to results reporting and feeding the kind of compliance machine in terms of corporate scorecards and dashboards and all those important things that evaluators often say are important for guiding an institution and helping boards know where they're going, and the space to be able to genuinely learn, take in information and use it effectively. Sometimes I feel we need to sort of slow down to go faster, that we need to create more space. And just sometimes there is a difficult tension between the need to push to feed the machine on results reporting and getting that data in, and what are we actually learning here and where might we need to change direction? And I think that's a particularly acute challenge in large bureaucratic organizations.
Thank you.
So everything the panelists are saying is resonating with me. I'm gonna talk about a couple of learning exercises and hopefully draw some insights from those. The first is our evaluation that we did of Canada's humanitarian program. We did it a few years ago, and I think every time I think about that work and I review the report, I see it in a different way. So, our humanitarian program, the decisions, the funding decisions, we found were often, not grounded in evidence. They were what people called it. It was an art and a science to choose where the money goes. And they used tried and true partners and practices. And it felt a lot like habit to me. And I was rather critical of that. Being an evaluator, I think one should always at least have a bit of data and evidence on which to base your decisions. But I came to understand that the way our humanitarian program people saw themselves as successful were two basic things: is one, money out the door, and two, adherence to humanitarian principles. That's it. And if they had done those two things, then their job was done. And at first I was, again, very critical of that, but I think I understand it more now. I think I understand it because they were worried. They didn't trust that us as evaluators would understand how important that is. And that we would come in and say, well, before you do anything, you need to wait and you need to have us do a whole bunch of work and we'll help tell you what to do. And by that time, a lot of people have suffered, right? And so I'm not sure we built enough trust to be able to give that advice that would be received. And we're still working on building that trust, because I'm not sure that we have cracked the nut in terms of what kind of work that we could do as evaluators to support the humanitarian program in their decision making. they're still very much focused on these outputs, measures of outputs. And I don't think they understand what the results or impacts of the work is. And I think that's really important. But I kind of agree with them that maybe evaluation isn't the right tool, or at least big, long evaluations. I think if we can do anything, we could help embed a culture of learning into humanitarian thinking. Because as evaluators, I think we're kind of experts at learning, or at least I hope we are. And we could work with other partners in our organization that are experts at learning and help embed that into our humanitarian program. So that's a work in progress. The second thing I'd want to mention is some work we did around the COVID crisis. And we did some lessons learned exercises. We led these lessons learned exercises around our organization, because of course we wanted to capture any lessons that were being learned around organizational structures, setups, HR, IMIT, those sort of things. And we did that work. You know, and we all thought this COVID crisis is so really unique that we're going to capture really unique lessons. And of course we didn't. It was the same topics and lessons that we should be learning all the time. I think we are learning a little bit, but I think the fact that they always come up, these same topics, these same issues, you know, communication, governance, those sort of things, means that there is probably some work we can do as evaluators in times of not crisis, to really work on those and get some good data around those and help our organization be better positioned for when a crisis does happen. Yeah, I think that's it for me.
Thank you very much. I think for me, what I would say generally from this, I would say exercise of evaluation is that in particular in these humanitarian activities or programs, what I would note is that there's no one size that fits all. And for me, this is very critical because many a times you find that a particular interventions or rather methodology and tools are being used from one area to another, and they are used to assess the other area. And that doesn't always bring the right results, but it brings a lot of negativity and resistance, and there's a lot of mistrust. And that, in a way, you find that it is also compelling away or compelling back the donor or the funders from continuing to support this program. So really, this is my humble appeal, particularly to the evaluators. Sometimes when they come into this aspect of evaluation, they really need to know that it is an issue of considering the context. But again, another thing we've noted is that evaluation needs all this type of program we're doing from the time we start with the designing to the planning and implementation. Innovation is very critical. You need to add, I would look at innovation as an active ingredient. You need to approach some of this program with an innovation, because with innovation, it will help you to be more open-minded, to be more flexible, and you really see what is it really working in this particular context. But again, most of these interventions we're doing, we need to be mindful of context, contextualizing things based on where you are. If you are not able to have programs that are context specific or evaluate based on that particular context, then you will fail and you will end up overburdening all these programs with a lot of evaluations and looking at the outcomes that may not be realistic. And finally, I think what we are learning from here is that the element of flexibility is very critical. And also the evaluators, sometimes when they come into this, they may come with all this attitude that 1 + 1 has to be 2. If you don't get 2, then you get it wrong. And for me, I argue that 1 + 1 can be 2 mathematically, but in the real life, 1 + 1 can be 5, can be 8, can be 9. You just have to explain and find the reason why that one has to work like that. If you're not able to do that, then you get it wrong and you blame the designer, but you didn't know what happened in the process of designing and in the implementation. So the flexibility has to be one of the active ingredients in the execution of this plan. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope you share with me the excitement of having this great panel. And as I hear them, I constantly wanted to interrupt them to ask questions, you know, because what they are saying is so meaningful. So instead of having one more round of questions with our distinguished panelists, I would like to open now the floor for your participation. There is a question over there, second, third. Please, sir.
Hi, I'm Dugan Fraser from the Global Evaluation Initiative. That was such an amazing panel. Thank you very, very much. And I want to remind people that the Global Evaluation Initiative is a broad umbrella under which a whole lot of initiatives work, including the CLEAR centers, IPDET, and our relationships with a whole bunch of countries, which we're very excited by. When we do our work strengthening evaluation systems, and we don't just talk about institutions, we talk about systems, one of the things that guides us is this understanding of the consequences of crisis being trauma. And that in many instances, we're working with people who are operating in a trauma context. And for us, the idea that trauma is best addressed through very, very close, deep relationships is very important. And we think that events like this, which we know are expensive and they have an environmental consequence, but they're a place where we're able to create the safety and the sense of collaboration that is essential in a trauma-informed practice. One of the things that we want to get out of this conversation here today is the Turin Agenda. And the Turin Agenda is intended as an opportunity for us as a collective to explain and describe what we expect of evaluation in the coming years. And as I think many of the panelists have said, we expect these crises to continue to intensify and to compound on one another. So when the panelists think about the future of evaluation and they think about the systems that they're going to be building, what do they see is the kind of vision for success? What is a successful evaluation system going to look like in 15 or 20 years?
Over there, a question, please.
Bonjour tout le monde. Je m'appelle M. Suleiman, de Djibouti. Donc, je félicite les pénalistes pour leur qualité, leur intervention. Donc, ma question s'adresse à Soudan. Donc, depuis que le Sud-Soudan s'est séparé avec le Soudan, donc il y a une guerre fratricide qui a dévasté le pays. Donc, les différentes évaluations qui ont été réalisées ont-elles permis infléchir les positions des décideurs? Parce que nous constatons que la crise continue sur le terrain. Donc, je vous remercie.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Over here to the lady, please.
Thank you so much. It was a great pleasure hearing to this all-women, high-powered panel. And I think one of the messages, yes, you all do deserve a round of applause. So one of the messages I think which came out from this very valuable session was the power of imperfection, and which is a hard lesson for us to learn when dealing with fragile context, as well as while working with the governments, where we are required to be responsive, and which must never undermine the value of providing this data, which is critical to planning. So from your learnings, I think with the recent crisis, what are some of the takeaways that we must have as we move forward towards organizing ourselves for future crises which are inevitable? So what are some of the critical things in our relationship with the governments that the development sector should have in place as we move forward? Thank you so much again.
Thank you very much. Shall we start the other way around? This time with you first, please, Angela.
Thank you very much. Maybe quickly, what I can reflect on what the first speaker or the first question was talking about. I do see the need for us to really set up system. I think I mentioned earlier on the issue of being context specific, but also the aspect of us knowing that there's no one size that fits all. So if we do have a system and we know we are approaching a particular context, we really need to see how we can involve the aspect of evaluation from the designing, but also even in the point where things will change at some point, we need to introduce the element of flexibility. How do we assess the interventions? But in the process of assessing, we need to put the human face, but also we need to consider those actors, the people on the ground, but also the actual situation that is happening. For me, that particular system will work out. But again, we are talking about empowering institutions to be able to come up with policies, but also the guidelines, as well as building capacities of the actors. And in the process of building capacity of actors, being it policymakers or the people who are implementing those particular practices, it could have been from the academic institution. Do we build up a mass of people with knowledge and skills in these particular areas so that the discussion about evaluation, for instance, the discussion of self-monitoring or continuous monitoring and continuous learning will not be seen as the final exam that you have to run after or you have to run away from, but it will be part of practice that we do live with it, and it is embedded within the system that we have. And in that way, people will not have to wait until the end of 5 years or maybe 2 years or a certain period for evaluation to take place. So it has to be built in, it has to be well understood, it has to be well articulated, but also we need to continue with massive awareness creation so that people can internalize the essence of having it and they will value it. Because I do see when we do go to, for instance, universities or school, we know that at the end of semester, we will do exams. Why are we not always running away? Why are we running away from evaluation? Why do we see evaluation as something that is actually there to hang you and slaughter you properly so that you will not be able to go? It's because of the way the approach is being used to reach out to this, to communicate about the information, but also to enlighten people on the essence of it. And also the outcome. How do we use that outcome? Do we communicate with the citizen who are the owner of the outcome so that them themselves can use that result to hold their leaders accountable for non-accomplishing? So if you're not able to involve all these key actors, definitely will fail. But again, the other question, I think it's about what is the success of evaluation. I think maybe I will leave that question to my colleague and then I will come back in at another time. Thank you.
I've been reflecting about this idea of what evaluation could and should look like in the future. And also what you're saying about being context specific and flexible. And I couldn't agree more. The evaluation of the future, I think, needs to be providing insights in very, very, very difficult situations. I think we need to embrace complexity, perhaps sometimes with a trade-off of this research purity that we all seek. We need to be robust. We need to give really good data. But I think we need to be open. And we need to have humility. I think humility is really one of the key words of the day. Because if you don't have humility, you can't learn yourself, right? I think we have to be open to non-traditional ways of knowing. We can't pretend that we've gotten it right yet. I don't think we have. I think that we can do a lot better and we could learn from a lot of different people. And our research techniques and tools that we are using today may not be the best to capture all that knowledge that is out there in the world. And I think we need to be open and adaptable to different ways of capturing that knowledge and to really listen to it, to not, talk to someone and really understand their position and come around saying, well, I'll keep recommending the same things that I've always recommended. I think we have to be bold and say sometimes, this speaking truth to power. I think we have to be bold and say what we're hearing is that we need to do things as a system vastly differently. So what I think that's some of the to be really plugged in as learners. I think humility is what we need, and I think if we have humility and openness, I think we could really contribute to a much better system. Voilà.
Thank you. So yes, to everything that Angelina and Isabel said. And I think on this point of humility, what does it translate into? Well, in part, it translates into us as an evaluation community exercising sort of deep listening, understanding, and not just telling. And I think there's always a slight risk in the evaluation community that we do a lot of telling because we have evidence and information that we want to communicate, but we aren't necessarily basing that on deep listening and a desire to understand. And I think we've just got to put that first and foremost at the forefront. Just anecdotally, and this is not going to be a unique experience, but when we were undertaking these 2 early stage assessments of the COVID response in the World Bank group, one thing that was very striking is that when we were engaging with World Bank group staff, particularly those who are located at the country level, and as it relates to Dugan's point, they were experiencing COVID too. It was devastating some of their families. It was incredibly difficult to be able to access healthcare. Even as World Bank staff, people were, scurrying around trying to find oxygen for their family members. And we were doing an early stage evaluation in that setting. And it was absolutely critical that we understood the circumstances of the staff who were delivering that COVID response, as well as the nature scale focus of that response. And that's super important. And I think it's really important for us going forward. Just quickly on the sort of systems of the future. I mean, there's been a lot of the discussion over the last couple of days has been about, I think, co-creating elements of that system of a future, how we want it to be. But my 2 points there would be, it has to be connected. Evaluation systems cannot exist in a vacuum. It has to be connected, forwards, backwards, to statistical systems, data systems, and forward to decision makers, to the users. And we need to connect it, for me, is the key word. And then we need to make friends with monitoring. When did it become a thing that as evaluators, somehow monitoring was a lesser sort of craft? We need to bridge that divide. It's fundamental. And I think we're probably all aware that in the absence of high quality, really well engineered monitoring, we as evaluators are a little bit naked. So let's make friends with monitoring, and that's part of the challenge going forward.
So first of all, thank you, Alison. Colleagues in WFP will remember last night we were having precisely this conversation about how to get better, about being friends with monitoring and what's stopping us from doing that. So I entirely agree with you on that. When Dugan asked your question, I thought, I don't have a vision, but I have hopes. The first, and I think it picks up on what Angelina and Isabel were saying, is it is about the use and the learning. So one of my hopes is that we have genuinely sort of multi-stakeholder access to learning. And that means the way that evaluation evidence is sort of put out there, it's accessible, is really, really key. One of my big concerns during the COVID response and through learning and reflection facilitated by LNAP, one of the things I was really concerned about was that many organizations, in doing their real-time learning and evaluation, that was all internal. It's all sort of sitting there and it's not accessible. It's not part of the wider body of evidence that we need to learn and reflect on. So having multi-stakeholder access to that and working on that as a global evaluation system is really important. But it's not just about what I said earlier, it's not just about the evaluation evidence. There's a whole spectrum of evidence that decision makers need. And that can be operational research, it can be data that's coming out of monitoring, it can be things coming out of voluntary national reviews. There's a whole swathe of evidence. And I think we need to get better at sort of interconnecting that. And also to have flexible access to that and to be able to draw on that in real time to inform real-time decisions. And some of those decisions are not necessarily big policy shifts, the kinds that Angelina was talking about. Going back to what Juliet was talking about earlier, in coming back to where I'm most at home at the moment in the humanitarian sector, individuals need that information now to inform what they're going to do today, if not tomorrow. We did a very interesting evaluation a few years ago looking at WFP's humanitarian access and principles. And we did a network analysis that found that humanitarians in WFP, their networks for working out what to do were very, very short and very, very localized. And that is a challenge because that means we're not transferring learning and innovation across the sector. So that brings me, I think, to one of my concerns that we have to address. It's getting those platforms up and out there, making use of artificial intelligence. The world is transforming so fast in this area. We've got huge potential, but we have to be designing that in the right way right now and thinking about what we want out of those systems so that they are connected. We are making sure there's interoperability between all of that. So it's not just sitting in research institutions, UN institutions. It's actually accessible to people in governments. It's accessible to people in deep field, in humanitarian settings in real time. And that brings me, I think, to two issues we have to deal with in the evaluation community and beyond. The first is ethics. We are a long way behind, I feel, on dealing with ethical issues in evaluation. It's not getting enough attention. And particularly if we start to look at ethical issues in this fast-moving data landscape, I think that's driving us to raise our game very fast. So maybe that's not 15 years from now. It's something we need to really deal with right away. Maybe I'll come to the other question, which was around recognizing different requirements. Here, maybe I just sort of flag again, this issue of transparency and accountability really matters for me. Humanitarian principles matters for me. When we're talking around crises, not all crises have the same power dynamics. One of the things when we're discussing crises such as South Sudan is the different actors involved, non-state armed groups, in some cases where governments are parties to conflict. This is something I think we have to think about a little bit when we're building and talking about national evaluation systems, because we need to make sure that we're not having too state-centric a model. And we are really genuinely building the kind of open, accountable, transparent societies that Angelina is talking about. So that's just possibly on that side of things, something for us to bear in mind. Because when we look at humanitarian principles, when we're looking at evaluation in conflict settings, that is something we always need to keep an eye on.
Great. I guess we're running a little short of time. Maybe I should be a bit quick. I think that when we think about evaluation systems of the future or evaluations of the future, I think that we have to be really aware that the learning challenge has fundamentally shifted, at least in the humanitarian sector, over the last 20 or 25 years. When RNAP started out, one of the big challenges to learning was lack of evaluations, lack of evidence, and lack of knowledge capture to understand what it was that needed to be done. Well, that's not the case anymore. Thankfully, we are rich in evidence and evaluations and knowledge. The learning challenge now, and it's common across all humanitarian agencies of all different types, is that it's really difficult for staff and organizations to capture and instrumentalize that learning in order to make change, whether it's in your organization, in your projects, or in the sector more widely. And that, I think, has to be, and I've been really enjoyed the very clear emphasis and prioritization of learning from across the panel. And in our role as learning facilitators, as evaluators, as learning facilitators, I think that's the challenge that we have to take. Most, at least humanitarians, do not have time to engage with evaluation findings. They do. I had to get a job at ALNAP to have time to read reports, because when I was in an operational agency, I had never read anything longer than an email. So, and that's a fundamental challenge. So I think that we really have to think about who we're communicating to, why we're communicating to them, and what they need to know. And that means that the role of the evaluator isn't simply about tabling the evidence. It's about helping to make sense of those findings for other people, and that's an uncomfortable shift. We we do a lot of evaluation synthesis, and we've been doing some rapid synthesis in response to new crises, the Pakistan earthquakes just recently. We went back to the 2010 evaluations, and the pain on the faces of the researchers in our team is like, Juliette, I just can't summarize it down any further. The nuance, the context, it's also important. It's like, nobody cares. Give them 3 messages. You've got 3 days, and I want 3 messages. And there's a very important clash of cultures that we need to create space for that. What is the information that people need to know? And I really enjoyed the point earlier about which knowledge it is. I think that we're also, at least in the humanitarian sector, there's a very northern dominance. The learning is harvested from the south. It comes up to the north, and then it's directed back down to the south again. Actually, within that, there's a lot of implicit assumptions about what knowledge is important, how it's harvested. And our whole sector is skewed towards having the least space for learning at the point at which the work is most important, which is in the projects. So there's the least space, there's the least value of that knowledge and learning, there's the least recognition of the importance of that experience. And we don't have the space within our sector to be able to, actually, or the tools to be able to capture and share that learning, when we know that evaluation itself is a very northern-driven concept that suits a very northern-driven agenda. And I think any evaluation system in the future is going to have to think a lot harder, not just about what makes good evaluation, but what makes for good learning.
Thank you very much. Please join me in applauding. Yes, and this emphasis of the panel on learning and is really remarkable. And at the same time, how the crisis brings opportunities, right? And in this sense, I think we have gone through a similar journey of trying to synthesize evidence of what worked in other crises, of getting out of other crises. And many organizations, including UNDP, Independent Evaluation Office, this type of reflection series that we put out. What did we learn from previous crises to prevent or to respond to the current crisis? And that led also to ask the questions, when do organizations learn? And I don't think it's precisely when we issue an evaluation report. We hope it would happen at that time when we are providing our recommendations, but we are increasingly coming to realize that organizations learn when they need to learn. And therefore, the possibility of catering all this evaluative evidence in a way that is accessible to decision makers the moment that they are needing it has led us also into the journey of using artificial intelligence to extract this evaluative evidence from the wealth of information that we already have. And that's how we created IDA, Artificial Intelligence for Development Analytics, which is accessible to the public. And you can see there how it is possible to get. And of course, we want to contribute with this little piece to increase the use of this type of tools. But apologies for having diverted and did a bit of commercial topics on how we responded also to the crisis. Colleagues, this has been a fascinating panel. Please join me in a round of applause to our distinguished panelists. We have now coffee break served downstairs, and then the sessions will start 11:15 sharp. So please get to the rest of your sessions. Many thanks again for a fantastic conversation.